This is the Game Changers Experience. Deep dive conversations with leading business disruptors, Olympic athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and influencers from around the world. This show will teach you insights about the winning principles in mindset, productivity, marketing, branding, entrepreneurship, business strategy, and more. Hosted by productivity authority, business strategist, former elite athlete, author, and public speaker, Adam Strong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Game Changers audio experience with myself, Adam Strong, and welcome to today's show. And today, on today's show, we have another amazing guest. He's actually been in my circle for probably the best part of about 2.5 years. His name is called Stephen Carter. He's an award-winning IP strategist and a bloody good one too, because he's also one of my clients and we do a lot of great collaborations. He's also a best-selling author. I forgot to mention that. We'll talk about that towards the end as well. And he's also got a podcast which has just come out called Rugby Balls and Stethoscopes. You're probably thinking, rugby balls and stethoscopes? What the hell is that all about? We'll talk about the podcast during the interview today. But what we're going to be talking about today, guys, is we're going to be talking about why is it that we need to protect our intellectual property? What is intellectual property? What are the pitfalls? What are the pitfalls, upfalls? Why is it that we need to have IP in our lives? Why is it that we need to value IP in our lives? Now, if you're going to also, we're going to be talking a little bit about if you're looking to resale or you're going to look at increasing the value of your company, what are investors looking for from an IP perspective as well? So without further ado, Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here. Good to see you.
Likewise. Very good.
I've got to correct you on one point before we get going.
Go for it.
The podcast is stethoscopes and rugby balls, not rugby balls and stethoscopes.
You see, I knew I'd get it wrong. I'd always kind of, I thought, you know what, the rugby ball sounds kind of cool, but then it's like, anyway. But okay, guys, so stethoscopes and rugby balls. Okay, let's just get that correctly. Okay, good. So we got the politically correct saying out the way. That's all good. Make sure you check that out on. You're on Apple, right? Apple, Google.
Yeah, on Apple and Spotify and Google, and the website stethoscopes and rugbyballs.uk.
Perfect, awesome. So make sure you go check out that, guys. All right, well, listen, welcome to the show. Great to have you on here. What I was going to say to you, I know that sort of the IP kind of arena, I remember us having conversations offline about this, because there's a lot of what I call myths around IP, where there certainly were a lot of false perceptions of what IP really is in a business and stuff like that. But could you just give us a synopsis about what is intellectual property? What should entrepreneurs and business owners look for when it comes to IP?
Yeah, sure. And I think you're right. There's a lot of misconceptions. And there's also, I guess, there's a lot of people that as soon as they hear intellectual property, the first thing they think is patents. Yeah. And then they think expensive. And then they think, no, that's not something for me. And that's just not wrong. Yes, patent part of it. And yes, they're a really important part of it, but they're not for everyone, and IP is so much broader than that. And I guess the starting point, and the thing I try and evangelize about, I suppose, is that if you're innovating, if you're an innovative business and you're innovating, then you are, as a matter of fact, creating intellectual property. That is, right. Intellectual property is the output from innovation. So and it's things like if you're writing software code, if you're coming up with new brand collateral, if you're recording podcasts, if you're recording video, if you're developing new processes that you're working with your coaching clients, if you're designing new products, all of these things, all of this innovation creates what I like to think of as intellectual property assets. So, the software code is an asset. Each one of those bits of brand collateral, so the logo, the brand name, the materials that go with it, each one of those is an intellectual property asset. And those assets, that collection of assets, are really the underpinnings of the value in any business, and alongside the people and their relationships.
Got it. Now, does this also include things like website copy? Does it also include things like brochures and things like that?
Absolutely. So we'll probably get into this a bit more, but so one thing you have to do is draw a distinction between what I refer to as the intellectual property assets. So they're the kind of things, they're the creations from your mind or from the mind of people working with you. And then the protection that goes alongside those. So again, when people think about intellectual property, they often are very focused on the protection, and they forget that the starting point is actually what's the stuff that's being created that we might want to protect. But you're right, any of that, the website copy is a creation from your mind, and it has value to your business because it's part of promoting your business. And that is protected, for example, with copyright.
Yeah.
So you've got the asset and then the protection that goes alongside it.
Very good. Awesome. Tell me, because I know that we talked just a second ago around kind of the myths around IP and stuff like that. And you already kind of mentioned about the fact that, if you think of like, patents or trademarks, you think of maybe big multi-billion Fortune 500 companies like Coca-Cola or McDonald's, thinking, how the hell am I going to afford a trademark or whatever it is, right? But let's talk a little, because I know that intellectual property, I mean, it's quite a big, it's quite a big thing, isn't it? I mean, you mainly focus here on patents, trademarks, innovations, those types of things. But let's talk a little bit about, like, what are some of the common myths that entrepreneurs and business owners may or may not think when it comes to investing in IP? And then we can also, I know we can also, what we'll also like to talk what I'd like to also talk about is to get into the nitty gritty bits of some of the common mistakes that a lot of these entrepreneurs and business owners make because of their, should we say, ignorance, okay, because of what they think IP is or isn't. What's your thoughts there?
I think you're right. So in terms of myths, I guess one of the big myths that I work hard to try and dispel is that IP, intellectual property, is just for the big boys. So it's that point you made. When people think about IP, whether it's the brand side of things, and they're thinking about the Coca-Colas of this world, or they're thinking about the technology side of things, and they're thinking about the Googles and the Apples and the Teslas, and yes, they do IP because they're big and they can afford it. Yeah. But that is a complete myth. I mean, as I said earlier, if you're innovating, and there's a ton of really small startups and SMEs that their whole lifeblood is innovation. That's what they're there to do, and they're creating IP, and it's the myth that needs dispelling is that IP and IP protection and IP strategy isn't relevant to them, because it is. And actually, the sooner that you start thinking as a small business or a startup about intellectual property strategy, the better, because there's that will put in place the right foundations, without having to invest too much cash, but putting in place the right foundations to set yourself up so that when you do get funding, or you get your second round of funding, you're in the right place to then be able to start protecting those innovations. And some of the things that go wrong in that scenario is simple things like, if you want to preserve the possibility of protecting your innovation with patents, let's take one example, so that's going to be relevant to a lot of technology businesses, whether that's kind of software tech or harder tech. Sort of, I do quite a lot of work, as you know, in the medical technology, so sort of medical device and digital health world, and clearly patents are relevant there. But if you're going to preserve the opportunity to get yourself a patent, it's really critical that you keep the details of your technology secret, and just having some simple rules in place for the people you're working with, so they understand that secrecy is important, can really help at that point. And that having a simple rule in place that says keep this stuff secret, that's part of an IP strategy. So this myth that IP strategy and IP generally is for bigger businesses is just totally wrong. The other one of the other big mistakes, and one of the biggest areas that I think trip smaller companies up when it comes to IP, is around the whole ownership piece. So again, I think when people talk about IP, they immediately focus on the protection side of things, which to me is very much the icing on the cake. Yes, if the budget's there, you want to be protecting and you want to be putting in place solid protection. But much more important than that, in my view, and the starting point, and if you like, the base foundation for all of this is making sure you own this stuff in the first place. And you might think, well, isn't that just, it's obvious. I'm creating it. My business is creating it. These people are creating it for me. Surely I own it. but that's, unfortunately, that's not the way that the IP laws around the world work in all cases.
Interesting.
So take the very simple case where you're using a software house to write some code for you. And clearly that's relevant to a lot of small businesses this day, because software and innovation is at the heart of a lot of businesses.
Yeah.
Unless you have the right contract in place with that software house, what the law says is that the default is that software house, rather than you or your business, will own the copyright in that software. So they basically have control of that software.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies, which should be relevant to an even broader cross-section of your listeners. And if you think about branding collateral, so an awful lot of people work with branding agencies, or they work with designers to create their logos, to create their brand names, and to create the other materials you're talking about, their websites, their brochures. And the IP, so all of these IP assets, the IP right that gives you the control over those in nearly all cases is going to be copyright. And again, that copyright, the way the law is written, the starting point is that copyright sits with the person who's created the assets. So the brand agency or the marketing agency in this case. Now, a lot of the time, you're working with good, honest branding agencies. Probably their standard terms and conditions will say, so long as you pay me what you owe me, then you get, and the rights are transferred to you. Yeah. So that's the default in most of their terms and conditions.
That makes sense.
But it's not always the case, and I've certainly encountered 2 or 3 occasions in the last few years where that's not been the case. And I've had conversations with growing businesses who've wanted to take their existing brand collateral and use it with a different marketing agency because they've grown, they feel they've outgrown the existing one. Maybe they're moving into the world of TV advertising, so it takes a different skill set, and they need to work with a new skill set, and they want to take their collateral that they've already got, and they want it to be kind of turned into a different format and be able to kind of build on that reputation, that kind of brand value that they've already got, but spread it to a wider audience through different channels. And they've started down the path of doing that, but they very quickly found out that actually they haven't got the rights to do it because the way the contract was written with the people that have created the brand collateral in the first place didn't transfer ownership of those IP assets to them. So basically the first agency have a strong hold over you in that situation, and you're left with the case where inevitably what often happens in those cases is you end up having to pay them more money to be able to use the collateral for other activities. Whereas if you'd been aware of this in the first place, you'd looked at the contracts that were in place, you could have negotiated that contract in the first instance to make sure that you had control, because that's what it's all about. I think at the end of the day, it's having control over those IP assets, so that you can ultimately down the line do what you want with them in a way that's going to benefit your business and allow you to make the revenue you want to make.
Makes sense. Makes complete sense to me. And if you've been in one of those situations, listeners, where you've maybe been, should we say, shafted by a branding agency or whatever it might be, okay, there's only one word that I have for you, which is gutted. Make sure that you read your terms and conditions. That's just the way. That's the only way that I can come to conclusions on that one. But it is sad. But also, you have to take responsibility at the end of the day. We all learn from our mistakes, so we have to make sure that we don't do them again. Make sure you read those little small prints in there. So you make a very good, valid point. I think the other thing.
The other thing I was going to add there about this whole ownership piece, which so often gets overlooked. And it's not, I've sort of picked a bit on branding agencies there, and actually, most of the branding agencies I know and have worked with are solid and reputable, and they will
Decent.
transfer the rights.
Yeah,
but you do come across cases or not. But it's not just brand; it is also working with the technology clients I'm working with. Particularly when you're starting out, there's often a lot of you're leaning on a lot of people for help, and so you've maybe got product design agencies involved. You might even have some input from universities. You might have people contracting for you rather than being employed by you, and all of these people or businesses that are involved in building the value. You need to really carefully examine the relationship you've got with them and the agreements that manage those relationships to make sure that IP is flowing back into the entity you want it to be in, which is typically your company. And why is that so important? Well, at the end of the day, if you're looking for investment, which again, ambitious companies, they're always on the lookout for the next round of investment. One of the things, particularly once you get to a more serious stage of investment where you're talking about serious amounts of money being put in, well-advised investors are going to be poking into all of this stuff, and they're going to work out quite quickly with the right advice that maybe you don't actually own and have control of some of this stuff. And it's so I can think of these ownership issues are often a bit like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah,
because they never actually reveal themselves until the worst possible moment, when you're in the middle of due diligence for your round of funding. And then all of a sudden they explode in your face, and you scurry around. Hopefully you can sort them out, but you scurry around, you spend more money, you're stressed out. You've maybe put off some investors at that point because they think, well, if this bit's gone wrong, what other ticking time bombs are there hiding there? True. Whereas actually with a little bit of investment up front at the early stage, and just some, I guess more it's more about just awareness and making sure there's this kind of IP ownership thinking in your mindset from the early days. You can just avoid these problems altogether.
So here's a question for you, and something that just prompted me to ask you this question. When should a business, whether it be right at the very beginning or whatever it is, because we know the pressures, we know how difficult it is to start up, manage a business. We know that because we're business owners and entrepreneurs ourselves. But at what stage from, whether it be from launch or whatever it is, when should we start protecting our IP? At what stage in the business?
You'd probably expect me to say this, but right from day one, ideally. But also I recognize that, particularly for a startup business, like you said, there's lots of, the to-do list is a long one. Of
course it is.
And there'll be there will be priorities that take precedence over the IP. But I think the problem, because IP is one of those things that people don't necessarily understand very well, it's easy to just keep pushing it down the to-do list and keep pushing it down the to-do list, and it never arrives at the top. And it depends. The potential damage that's done by that depends a lot on the nature of the business. So if you're let's take the example of a business where there's no kind of real technology. It's all about let's take coaching business, for example. So the coaching business tends to be about it's the training, coaching collateral that you're creating, and it's the brand around that. What can go wrong, you might think? Well, I guess the most important thing there is the brand side of things. And if you're putting a lot of effort into promoting that brand and building that brand, if you don't have the appropriate trademark protection in place, and maybe more importantly, if you haven't checked out the risk side of things, because this is the other thing that people forget. Yes, it's great having your own IP and it's great putting your own protection in place, but you're not the only one doing that. There's a whole world of people out there that are also doing the same thing and that are doing it right, and they're getting their own protection. And in many ways, it's much worse for you as a business to invest a lot in building your own brand and then run in, slap bang into a brick wall because you find out someone else has a trademark that you're infringing.
Yes.
And that's, it's embarrassing. It's the PR. It can be a PR nightmare. It can be expensive in terms of, dealing with that now legal issue you're facing, as well as inevitably, or often having to rebrand as a result. So if you're building a brand, the right time to start thinking about IP is the point in time where you're thinking about seriously investing in that brand and building the reputation.
Makes sense.
So, as a coaching business, when you're starting out, you might start by kind of building some of the collateral, or maybe doing some beta testing of programs with some small groups of clients, and then you get a bit of momentum, and then you think, right, now we're going for the big push. Before you go for that big push, that's the time to get the brand protection, or basically check you're not going to be infringing anyone else's trademarks, and be prepared at that stage if you need to rebrand an early stage before you've invested a lot in it.
It's interesting. I was going to say to you, I think one of the reasons why I didn't invest in IP earlier on is probably because, number one, it's I think it was down to, well, there was a couple of reasons. I think the first reason that I didn't invest in IP is, number one, is you're so focused on generating revenue, right? If you don't have cash flow, then you don't have a business. It's as simple as that. You need the cash flow, right? But secondly, because intellectual property is not tangible, it's not something that you can touch. You know what I mean? It's like cryptocurrency. You can't touch cryptocurrency, or there's lots of things that you can't touch. And so if it's not tangible, it's like, well, and then you start to question the value of intellectual property. Is this really going to help me in the short term? It will happen definitely on the long term, but I think some of us can be very, what I call, short-sighted, especially if we're going through a journey of confusion, because I think that a lot of entrepreneurs and startup companies, and you'll know about this anyway, is that they become very confused about what is it that they really want to offer to the world in terms of their key target audience. And clarity, I think, is so important, because the more clear that you have in your head, the more the more that, in terms of clarity, in terms of the IP that you want to then register or kind of like protect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. That clarity is important. And, at the end of the day, the IP protection is just a business tool. It's something that it serves a purpose, but it has to serve that purpose in the context of the business as a whole. There's no point. Yeah. Okay. There's some cases where the IP is the business, and the model is to license that IP, and so the IP, if you like, is the product that's generating the revenue directly. But in most cases, for most businesses, the IP is just the tool that you're using to help help give you that competitive advantage, help protect the value that you've created. So you can't. It's no point throwing money at IP in isolation, just thinking, I need IP, let's get some IP.
Exactly.
It's all about, when I'm working with a business to help them, the starting point is always me understanding the business plan. Basically, what is it?
Yes.
Why do you exist? What is it you're trying to achieve?
Yep.
What are your plans going forward? Because it's only once you understand that you can then say, well, given this is what you have now, and this is what you're looking to build, and this is what you're looking to achieve, this is how you can use IP protection as a tool to help you achieve that.
Yeah.
And any, it's obvious, isn't it, when you say it, but any IP strategy really does have to be very closely aligned with the business strategy.
Yeah.
And I would, I think it's one of the reasons why it's good to be thinking about IP from the outset, because a lot of the value in a business is these days is in its intangible assets. It's not, a lot of businesses aren't, the value in the business isn't built on the stuff you can touch and see. True. It's built on the intangible stuff. And yes, quite a lot of that is maybe not what you traditionally consider as IP, because it tends to be, it's the relationships, and it's the people, and it's the thoughts, the minds of those people contributing to the business. But there's a lot of it that would fall under the IP, and if you don't have that kind of IP thinking embedded in the business, then that's where things can go wrong quite quickly when you get bigger. And people do. I'll tell you a story, which is it's kind of a sad story, and I won't name any names because it's someone that I work with, but just an example of where it can go wrong. And I'm going to use a trademark example again, because although a lot of what I do is on the kind of technology side of things, which means it's a lot of patents and trade secrets. Branding's kind of more accessible to everyone, isn't it? Because we all, every business has a brand.
Absolutely. Actually, before you share your story, I'm gonna because what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure before we go into kind of this worst case scenario thing, let's talk about if you was to invest in IP, what's the best case scenario? We're like, what is the best case scenario? And then we can talk about the worst case scenario. Then we can talk about, well, based on what we know, what we've got protected, what's the most likely outcome of what we're going to do with our business? Any thoughts there?
So kind of as in a model, as in this is what you would ideally do in a
yeah, exactly. So
the gold standard for IP for a startup.
The gold standard, absolutely. Let's go for it.
So I guess let's kind of try and take a bit of a hypothetical example. Let's say it's let's say it's someone who's developing, I don't know, a medical device that has a software element to it and a physical element to it. And they're going to be selling it across multiple marketplaces, and it's going to have a brand associated with it, because they're selling, it's B2B sales, but you still have a brand, don't you? And so I guess they start their journey. They probably have some really clever science and thinking behind it, maybe spun out of university. So the first thing they'd be doing is making sure that they understand the relationship with the university and who has control of which rights there. And in an ideal world, they'll have taken a transfer of those rights from the university. So you've got this nice little self-contained entity that has the initial, kind of science and maybe a prototype in it. They then get a bit of seed funding or maybe grant-based funding that they use to develop that and get it to the point where it's ready to go to market. And because it's a medical device, there'll have been a whole kind of regulatory approval piece involved in there. So this can be quite a long time frame you're talking about.
Yeah.
And there may have been another round or two of fundraising in the process. But what they'd also be looking at in those early days would be making sure that they've got some, one or more patent applications filed that are protecting the technology innovation aspects of it. They'd be making sure they'd be very careful that if they're using external suppliers or partners or contractors to help them, which they probably will be, so they're probably working with a product design agency to come up with the nice stylish design for this medical device. They're probably working with a software house who write in the code that's going to control the software, the medical device. They'll be making sure that they've got the right agreements in place with all of those companies, so that all of the IP and the control of that IP is flowing back to the company. So you've still got this nice one entity that owns all of the IP, has control over it, knows exactly who they're working with, and has agreements in place with all of them. And they've probably got a good one of the things that trips people up is the record keeping side of this. So having a good system for keeping track of who you're working with, what agreements are in place with them, what IP assets are being generated, what protection you put in place for those. So I talk to people a lot about having it's kind of an IP asset register is the kind of name I'd give it, but which could be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, might be something a bit fancier, but basically just a central repository where you've got all this stuff listed. So that's and that has the benefit. One, it helps you easily see where there are holes. So if you're keeping a track of all these relationships in a central place, you can very easily see where there's a new partner that you're starting to engage with, and you haven't yet got an agreement in place with them. So that kind of can flag up, right, that's straight on top of the to-do list, get the agreement in place with them. It's also, it's a bit like you're kind of starting to build the data room that you're going to need when you come to rounds of investment.
True. Because
investors are going to ask for all this information about your IP portfolio and about the relationships and the agreements you've got with your partners and employees and contractors. And if you've got it all documented centrally, it's a really easy job to then provide that information to investors. Whereas actually what you know, in practice, what you often see is each time you go into an investment round, just scurrying around trying to pull together all of that information. So there's, you know, there's benefits and time and cost savings there as well.
Definitely.
So then as you're approaching the market point where you're going to start marketing this, you probably got some ideas about what you're going to call it. One of the other mistakes I think people make is they set themselves, they fall in love with a name for a product at a really early stage, and like their product's going to be called this and they want it to be called this, and it actually doesn't
make any sense, does it?
Doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't. You know, you become wedded to it, you make silly decisions about the risk you're prepared to take to carry on using that name. Whereas actually the right time to look at it is as you're approaching the point where you're going to start marketing. That's when you're going to start building the value in a brand. So go through a proper process at that point. You know, one, probably working with the branding agency, but you know, come up with a good brand, but probably come up with several options. Do some trademark searching. That might rule out 2 or 3 of those options straight away because there's, you know, competitors or other businesses on the market that have trademark registrations that are going to cause risk for you if you were to launch with that name. Yeah. Hopefully you find a good name that's not going to cause you any problems in terms of infringing other people's rights.
Yep.
And then you file your trademark applications to protect that brand so you can maintain exclusivity in it.
Very good.
And then, then progressing forward beyond that, you might be looking to expand into other markets. And that's another thing that can go wrong, which is when people that don't necessarily think early enough about where their markets are going to be in 5 years' time. And in the patent world, it's really important to think about it early, because once your product is out there in the public domain, it's too late in most countries to then subsequently get patent protection. So you need to, you know, there's mechanisms for meaning, yeah, that allow you to not file all of your applications on day one. But basically you need to be thinking about it and have a plan in place. And similarly for the trademark side of things. Yep. You know, as you expand geographically, again, you've got the 2 things you have to address. You've got the risk side of things, because just because you were risk-free in the UK, if that's where you launched, it doesn't mean that you're going to be risk-free in the US if that's your next big market. True. So you need to go through the same process. Let's look in the US, see whether there's any issues you're going to face, and also secure your own protection. And you can do that, you know, stage by stage as you expand. But if you know on day one that, you know, your big markets are going to be UK, Europe, and US, it makes sense to actually do those checks, or at least at a cursory level at the outset, because there's no point adopting a brand. Or if your strategy is going to be that you want to have the same brand across all of those markets, then you're better off finding a brand that lends itself to doing that from the outset, rather than having to, you know, catch up later. Very good. Awesome. Very cool.
I suppose the other thing that I put on here as well, we kind of already touched on it a little bit, which is all about, you know, what are the IP assets that we need to have in place for investors? Because effectively we were talking about like businesses in this day and age. If you're building a business to either be sold and acquired, that's generally why we're in business, right? We want to sell it and get it acquired or whatever it is. But how does IP make, how does IP increase the valuation of a company? You know, are there some figures there? And if we don't have those protections in place, you know, or is an investor going to look at, oh no, it's worth much less now because they haven't got the IP in place? What's your thoughts about that? Have you had any conversations with investors or VCs or angels?
Yeah, sure. And it does depend. It depends a bit on the stage of the business, to some degree. But I certainly had an interesting conversation recently. I was hearing from an investor who was saying that particularly for the early stage, I think everyone kind of knows that particularly for early stage companies, investors are often looking for the market opportunity. Yeah. You know, is there an opportunity to kind of build a business that's going to make money? And is the team the right team to be doing that? And I think often, from the conversations I've had, they're described in slightly different ways, but they're the two themes that come out as the main thing.
Yeah.
And so where does IP fit into that? Well, I think this investor that was speaking with the other day, one of the really interesting things they said that I'd actually not really thought about before is that they almost see the business's approach to IP as a bit of a barometer on the management thinking and the management approach. And so if the management are thinking appropriately about their IP and they've got a sensible, for their size of business strategy in place, if they're doing that, if they're ticking that box, then there's a good chance that they're thinking in the right way about the business as a whole. So it's almost like like I said, it's a barometer. If this is good, then it's a good sign, even if the investment isn't being made just because there's good IP there. And I think more generally, if you think about the role IP plays, it comes back to one of the points I made earlier, which is IP is only as good as to the extent that it supports the business and the overall business goals. And the overall business goals are about selling stuff, and generally, and they're about selling stuff with a decent margin. And from an investment point of view, if you know that the business is going to be able to protect that margin and protect that competitive advantage for a sufficiently long period of time, then you're going to keep the return on your investment you're looking for. And IP is one of the things that can help preserve that return on investment, because it's at the end of the day, IP is generally it's a negative right. It's an ability to stop other people doing something. It doesn't give you the right to do the thing yourself. But if you can use your IP as an obstacle to the competition, then that clearly preserves your market position. It preserves your ability to charge a premium price, and so it makes it more likely that an investor is going to be able to recoup and you make the returns they want to make. So that's makes sense. I guess that that's one of the roles it plays.
So interestingly enough, we talked about this earlier. Stethoscopes and rugby balls, which I got it right this time, by the way. Tell us a little bit about your little podcast, because I know it's relatively new and stuff like that. What was I mean, I'm fascinated about the title. Tell us more about the title and why you created it.
So I suppose what one of the, I mean, this business I'm running now, the Intellectual Property Works, it's still relatively new itself. So I'm just over 3.5 years into this now. Building on the whatever, it almost makes me feel too old, but the 20-something years of patent attorney, traditional patent attorney work I did before that. And it's all about, like, the new business is aimed very much about helping startup and smaller businesses do IP properly, basically. I recognised working with a whole range of different businesses over the years, but quite a lot in the sort of medical technology, sports technology space, that there's a lack of appreciation in the smaller companies to how important IP can be. And so I'm really keen to engage with those companies and help them in a way that gives them a better chance of succeeding, so they can go on and do the great things in the world that they want to do. And the podcast, I guess, was one of the kind of natural progressions in terms of pushing my business out there a bit more and trying to spread this message a bit more. But I also, I guess, recognized that, like, a podcast that just talked about IP could get quite dull.
I was thinking about that. IP, it's a bit of a dull conversation. I hope you.
I mean, I obviously find it very exciting, but I recognise that not everyone does. But so I thought, well, let's how can I be helpful to the community of smaller businesses that that I want to be working with, that I enjoy working with, and that's kind of where stethoscopes and rugby balls was born from, because it's all about the podcast. The premise of the podcast is all about having conversations with people working. So it's got a bit of a focus on med tech and sports tech, hence stethoscopes and rugby balls.
Love it.
But it's conversations with people that have lived in that world, have lived and breathed that world, but from different perspectives. So some of the conversations are with founders and leaders in those businesses in that field, talking about their journey in kind of building that business and taking product to market. And yes, when I can steer the conversation around to it a bit about how IP has played a role in that. Some of the conversations are with advisors to businesses in that field. So we had a great session that's the one that's been published so far in this first series with a tax specialist, and kind of how a bit like the way I talk about including IP thinking in your from the outset. That discussion was all about how actually if you think about tax from the outset, you can avoid a lot of potential problems down the line. So talking to people that advise small businesses like that, because I think they can add a lot of value. And then also talking to people who have and do invest in small businesses in those markets and getting the investor perspective on it. And the last interview in this first series is going to be with someone with that investment background. So that's going to be a particularly interesting one, I think.
Very cool. Very good. Awesome. Now, I know that you've also one of our contributing authors in our book, Play the Game, which is very good. There you go. Perfect. There's his copy. Super. Now, your title in your chapter is called Innovate or Die. I mean, when I read that title of that chapter, I thought, bloody hell. I said, if that's not telling you to get your IP sorted, I don't know what is. But tell us a little bit about Innovate or Die.
It was... I don't know. I mean, I guess it's catchy, isn't it? I hope.
Very catchy.
But I think it's so true as well. In this, small businesses in this day and age, if you're not innovating, if you're standing still, then I think ultimately you will die. I mean, I think agreed.
Yeah. Sounds hard hitting, but it's true.
Yeah, and I guess my point and the motivation behind writing the chapter. Is that innovation without an understanding of IP is also something that leads to problems. And it comes back right to the beginning of this conversation, where if you're innovating, you're creating IP assets.
Yeah.
And if you don't have in place the right kind of framework to make sure that you own those assets and are free to commercialize those assets in the way you want to commercialize them, and that you've got the appropriate protection in place, or at least preserving the opportunity to get the right protection in place down the line, then you're not maximizing the value that you're getting out of that innovation, and you're not maximizing the opportunity for you and your investors to create and grow value in that business.
Yeah, very good. Very true. Well, listen, it's been great to talk to you. I know we're coming towards the end of our interview now. But for you guys that are listening in and hope you've been enjoying some of our conversations, you can actually read more about Stephen and the intellectual property works by getting a copy of Play the Game, by the way. Not that we've been promoting it or anything on the podcast at all, but get yourself a copy of Play the Game. It's available all over the world. You can get it in all good bookstores, on Amazon, or a book depository, whatever it is that you prefer to go to, or wherever it is, but it's available worldwide. And make sure that you check out and read what Stephen is talking about in terms of IP. It'll give you an idea of exactly in terms of intellectual property and knowing how to protect yourself and your assets, stuff like that. So, but Stephen, just want to say thanks very much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Very cool. And guys, make sure you check out the links below as well. If you reach out to Stephen on LinkedIn or any other means on social media, make sure that you mention this particular podcast as well, so that you can click two and two together, and go check out Stethoscopes and Rugby Balls. And we'll see you again back here on the Game Changers Audio Experience. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Cheers now. Thank you so much for listening into today's show. I hope that you have enjoyed today's show. Just a reminder, we love creating this amazing podcast show. It wouldn't be as successful if it wasn't for you guys. So we want to make sure that we would love it if you would be able to reciprocate and write an amazing, whether it be a 1-star or 5-star review. If you're listening to this on Apple, go to Apple on iTunes and go to the Game Changers Audio Experience, leave a 1 or a 5-star review, whichever you prefer. If you're listening to this on Android, whether it be on Amazon Music, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and all the good Android platforms, go to podchaser.com, that's podchaser.com, and leave a 1 or a 5-star review on there. We'll be extremely grateful. Thanks very much for tuning in. We've got some great shows coming up. Cheers.